In the late 1950s, as France emerged from the combined trauma of occupation, liberation, and rapid decolonization, a quiet but decisive conclusion took hold inside the highest levels of the French state, which was that national survival in the nuclear age could not be entrusted to Allied guarantees, shared command structures, or external political decision-making, and that France would therefore need to control its own nuclear forces completely, from political authorization down to technical execution, regardless of cost or diplomatic friction. This conclusion did not arise from abstract theory, but from lived experience, because French political and military leaders had watched their country overrun in 1940, excluded from wartime strategic decision-making thereafter, and relegated to junior status in the post-war security order, despite its global interests and permanent seat aspirations, creating a deep institutional memory that equated dependence with vulnerability. As early Cold War security arrangements crystallized around U.S.-led alliances, French planners assessed that reliance on extended deterrence meant accepting that the ultimate decision to risk national destruction would be made in Washington, under political and strategic conditions that might not align with French survival. And this assessment hardened into doctrine as nuclear weapons reshaped the logic of war itself. The core of France's emerging strategic autonomy doctrine was simple but uncompromising, that deterrence only functioned if an adversary believed the political authority ordering retaliation was both sovereign and willing to act solely in national interest, and that any ambiguity over who controlled nuclear release would weaken credibility rather than strengthen it. This logic drove France toward an independent nuclear command system that would be structurally separate from US and UK frameworks, legally insulated from alliance mechanisms, and operationally designed to function even if France were politically isolated or physically severed from Allied communication networks. The development of this system unfolded alongside, but deliberately apart from, NATO's evolving nuclear arrangements, as French leaders rejected models that embedded national forces within multinational command chains or pre-delegated authority to Allied commanders, viewing such integration as incompatible with the political meaning of deterrence itself. Instead, French doctrine emphasized unity of command under the head of state, treating nuclear authority as an extension of national sovereignty rather than a shared military function, and this emphasis reshaped how France designed its political institutions, military hierarchies, and technical infrastructure during the transition into the nuclear age. The establishment of the Fifth Republic in 1958 accelerated this process by concentrating executive power in the presidency, creating a constitutional framework that aligned perfectly with the requirements of centralized nuclear decision-making, as the president was explicitly positioned as the ultimate guarantor of national survival, capable of acting decisively under extreme conditions without parliamentary delay. Within this framework, nuclear command was not treated as a routine military function, but as a unique domain governed by separate rules, specialized procedures, and a deliberately narrow circle of authority, reinforcing the symbolic and practical separation between conventional forces and the strategic arsenal. French planners recognized early that independence in command required independence in information, communication, and execution, meaning that reliance on Allied early warning, targeting data, or communication relay would undermine the very autonomy the doctrine sought to preserve. And this recognition drove investment in national detection systems, hardened communication networks, and bespoke command infrastructure designed to operate under the assumption of isolation rather than integration. The resulting command architecture prioritized survivability and continuity over efficiency, accepting redundancy, cost, and technical complexity as necessary trade-offs for political control, and this acceptance distinguished French thinking from alliance models that emphasized shared resources and interoperability. Strategic autonomy doctrine also shaped how French leaders conceptualized deterrence itself, rejecting notions of flexible response or graduated escalation in favor of a deliberately stark logic in which any nuclear attack on France would trigger retaliation without negotiation or coalition deliberation, reinforcing the credibility of the threat by removing ambiguity about process, even if uncertainty remained about outcome. This posture required that command authority remain unmistakably national at every stage, from warning to decision to execution, and that no external actor possess veto power, delay mechanisms, or procedural influence over French nuclear use. The construction of such a system was not merely technical, but cultural, embedding autonomy into training, planning, and institutional identity across the French strategic community, and by the early 1960s, this identity had hardened into a defining feature of French defense policy. The insistence on independence inevitably generated friction with allies, particularly as alliance planners sought coherence and predictability across Western deterrent forces. But French leaders judged that the strategic cost of dependence outweighed diplomatic inconvenience, especially given France's global interests and colonial legacies that extended beyond the European theater. This judgment was reinforced by assessments that U.S. nuclear strategy prioritized the superpower balance rather than the defense of individual allies, and that French survival could not be subordinated to calculations centered on intercontinental exchange. As a result, France pursued a nuclear command system that was intentionally opaque to allies, sharing political intent but not operational detail, and maintaining strict national custody over release procedures, communication pathways, and targeting logic. By the mid-1960s, this approach had matured into a coherent strategic doctrine in which independence was not a temporary posture, but a permanent condition, shaping how France positioned itself within the Western alliance, while remaining structurally outside its nuclear command mechanisms. The creation of an autonomous nuclear command system thus represented not a rejection of collective defense, but a redefinition of it, in which France contributed to overall deterrence through the certainty of its independent response rather than through integrated planning. This foundational period established the principles, assumptions, and institutional structures that would govern French nuclear command for decades, anchoring strategic autonomy not as a rhetorical aspiration, but as an operational reality built into the state itself. As the 1960s progressed, France's commitment to an independent nuclear command system moved from conceptual design into operational reality, as the state began constructing the practical mechanisms required to ensure that nuclear authority could be exercised under the most extreme conditions imaginable, including isolation from allies, disruption of communications, and direct attack on national territory. And this transition forced French planners to confront the full implications of strategic autonomy beyond rhetoric. Central to this effort was the development of a national command chain that would remain intact even if conventional military structures were degraded or destroyed, requiring separation not only from alliance frameworks, but also from routine defense bureaucracy, because nuclear command was treated as a unique function whose continuity could not be assumed under normal military assumptions. The presidency stood at the apex of this system, not symbolically but operationally, as procedures were designed to ensure that the head of state retained exclusive authority over nuclear release, supported by a narrowly defined advisory and execution structure whose membership, responsibilities, and communication pathways were deliberately constrained. This concentration of authority reflected a judgment that deterrence credibility depended on decisiveness rather than consultation, and that diffusion of responsibility would introduce hesitation at the moment when clarity was most required. To support this model, France invested heavily in hardened command posts and redundant communication networks that were physically and procedurally distinct from those used for conventional operations, accepting significant cost in order to reduce reliance on infrastructure that might be compromised or controlled by external actors. These command facilities were designed with survivability as the primary criterion, emphasizing protection against blast, electromagnetic effects, and prolonged isolation, and their location and configuration reflected the assumption that the political leadership might be required to operate under attack rather than merely during crisis. Communication systems were treated with equal seriousness, as French planners recognized that an independent command authority was meaningless without reliable means of transmitting orders to dispersed nuclear forces, and this recognition drove the development of national communication networks that avoided dependence on Allied relays, shared satellites, or multinational hubs. Instead, the system emphasized redundancy across multiple transmission modes, including buried cables, hardened relay stations, and specialized airborne assets, ensuring that no single point of failure could sever the link between political decision and military execution. These choices reflected a broader doctrinal assumption that war in the nuclear age would be characterized by disruption and uncertainty rather than orderly escalation, and that command systems must therefore be designed to function in degraded conditions rather than optimized for peacetime efficiency. This assumption distinguished French thinking from alliance models that emphasized interoperability and shared situational awareness, reinforcing the separation between national deterrent forces and collective military planning. The requirement for autonomy also shaped how French nuclear forces were organized and deployed, as units were structured to receive orders directly from national command authorities without passing through multinational chains or Allied headquarters, and training emphasized adherence to national procedures, even when operating alongside Allied forces in conventional contexts. This separation was not merely administrative, but conceptual, reinforcing the idea that nuclear forces existed in a different, strategic domain from conventional military cooperation. The doctrine of strategic autonomy further influenced how France approached warning and assessment, as reliance on Allied intelligence for early warning or targeting data was viewed as a vulnerability rather than a benefit, leading to investment in national detection capabilities and analytical structures designed to provide independent judgment, even if Allied information were unavailable or contradictory. This insistence on independent assessment reflected a belief that deterrence credibility required not only control over execution, but also confidence in perception, because misinterpretation of events could be as destabilizing as technical failure. As these systems came online, French planners increasingly tested them through exercises and simulations that assumed worst-case conditions, including severed communications, degraded situational awareness, and rapid decision timelines, reinforcing a culture in which autonomy was practiced rather than merely asserted. These exercises revealed tensions inherent in the system, particularly the burden placed on a small number of decision-makers and the challenge of maintaining readiness without integrating into larger alliance structures. Yet French leadership accepted these costs as the price of sovereignty in the nuclear age. Relations with allies during this period were shaped by careful signaling, as France sought to reassure partners of its commitment to collective defense, while making clear that its nuclear forces would not be subordinated to alliance command. a balance that required diplomatic discipline and strategic ambiguity. The resulting posture was neither isolationist nor fully integrated, but deliberately distinct, contributing to overall deterrence through the certainty of an independent response rather than through coordinated planning. By the late 1960s, France's independent nuclear command system had reached a level of maturity in which its basic architecture was established and its operational principles internalized across the political and military leadership, anchoring strategic autonomy not as a temporary stance, but as a permanent feature of national defense policy. This maturation marked a critical phase in which independence moved from aspiration to routine practice, setting the conditions for how France would manage its nuclear forces during subsequent decades of Cold War tension, technological change, and shifting alliance dynamics. By the early 1970s, France's independent nuclear command system faced its most demanding test not from external threat alone, but from the challenge of sustaining credibility, coherence, and survivability as technology, alliance politics, and strategic assumptions evolved, because strategic autonomy was not a static achievement, but a condition that had to be continuously maintained against erosion from both integration pressures and internal complexity. As nuclear forces expanded and diversified, French planners were forced to confront the problem of coordinating multiple delivery systems, airborne, land-based, and later sea-based, under a single national authority without reproducing the very bureaucratic sprawl and procedural diffusion that independence had been designed to avoid. This tension shaped the evolution of command procedures, as France sought to preserve unity of decision while accommodating the operational realities of dispersed forces operating in different domains, each with its own timelines, vulnerabilities, and communication requirements. The solution was not integration into alliance structures, but further refinement of national command arrangements, including clearer delineation between political authorization and military execution, and stricter compartmentalization of information to ensure that no single failure could compromise the entire system. Political control remained absolute, with the president retaining exclusive authority to order nuclear use. But the mechanisms supporting that authority became more elaborate, reflecting recognition that survivability depended as much on procedural clarity as on physical protection. Communication resilience continued to dominate planning, as advances in electronic warfare and the growing awareness of electromagnetic vulnerability reinforced the assumption that nuclear command would operate in an environment of degraded or intermittent connectivity, prompting further investment in hardened links, diversified transmission paths, and autonomous execution capability at the force level once authorization was received. This focus on degraded operations influenced training and doctrine, as French nuclear forces were conditioned to expect isolation and uncertainty rather than continuous guidance, reinforcing a command culture that emphasized strict adherence to pre-established national procedures rather than adaptive coordination with allies. The persistence of strategic autonomy also shaped France's relationship with technological change, as reliance on allied systems for navigation, targeting, or communication was consistently evaluated through the lens of political dependence rather than technical efficiency, leading to national solutions even when they were more costly or slower to implement. This approach extended to early warning and assessment, where French authorities maintained independent analytical channels to interpret strategic developments, rejecting the assumption that Allied intelligence consensus necessarily aligned with national interest, and reinforcing the belief that misaligned perception could undermine deterrence as surely as loss of control. Alliance dynamics during this period remained delicate, as France navigated its position outside integrated nuclear planning while remaining a key Western power, and French leaders consistently framed independence not as withdrawal from collective defense, but as a stabilizing contribution that complicated adversary calculations by introducing an additional autonomous decision center. This framing required careful diplomatic management, particularly as alliance partners sought predictability and coherence in deterrence posture, while France insisted on opacity and national discretion as sources of credibility. The institutionalization of autonomy also had internal consequences, as the concentration of nuclear authority in a narrow decision circle raised questions about succession, continuity, and legitimacy under crisis conditions, prompting further procedural safeguards to ensure that command authority could be exercised even under extreme disruption without diffusing political responsibility. Exercises and internal reviews during the 1970s increasingly emphasized these continuity challenges, testing scenarios in which leadership was isolated, communication was intermittent, and decision timelines were compressed, reinforcing the assumption that deterrence depended on preparedness for worst-case conditions rather than ideal coordination. The acceptance of these assumptions distinguished French doctrine from alliance approaches that emphasized graduated response and shared escalation management, underscoring a philosophical divergence in how nuclear stability was understood. By the mid-1970s, France's independent nuclear command system had become deeply embedded in state practice, shaping not only military procedures, but political identity, as strategic autonomy was treated as a defining attribute of sovereignty rather than a contingent policy choice. This embedding made reversal increasingly unlikely, as dismantling autonomy would have required not only technical reintegration, but a fundamental redefinition of national authority in the nuclear age. As Cold War tensions fluctuated and new arms control frameworks emerged elsewhere, France's command system remained deliberately outside shared control regimes, reinforcing its insulation from external constraint while preserving freedom of action. This period demonstrated that strategic autonomy was sustained not by isolation, but by continuous adaptation, as France refined its command structures to absorb technological change and political pressure without surrendering control. The endurance of this system through the 1970s thus reflected a deliberate choice to prioritize sovereignty and decisiveness over efficiency and integration, anchoring French nuclear command as a permanent, self-contained architecture designed to function under conditions where alliance mechanisms might fail or fragment. As the late 1970s moved into the early 1980s, France's independent nuclear command system confronted a strategic environment that tested the assumptions on which autonomy had been built, because advances in surveillance, precision strike, and electronic warfare raised persistent questions about whether any national command authority could remain survivable, isolated, and decisive under modern conditions, and French planners responded by doubling down on the principles of independence rather than diluting them through integration. This period was marked by an intensified focus on continuity of command, as internal assessments acknowledged that the credibility of deterrence rested not only on the existence of nuclear forces, but on the adversary's belief that French political authority would remain functional and willing to act even after suffering severe disruption, a belief that could not be sustained if command structures appeared fragile or dependent on allied systems. To address this, France refined its succession procedures and emergency decision protocols, ensuring that presidential authority over nuclear use could be exercised under conditions of isolation, displacement, or physical threat, while preserving the symbolic and legal centrality of the head of state as the sole source of legitimacy for nuclear action. These procedures were deliberately insulated from routine military command chains, reinforcing the separation between strategic decision-making and operational execution, and limiting the number of individuals with access to critical information to reduce both vulnerability and ambiguity. Communication resilience remained a dominant concern, as French planners assumed that nuclear command would operate in an environment of contested electromagnetic spectrum and intermittent connectivity, prompting continued investment in diversified transmission paths that avoided reliance on shared alliance infrastructure, including hardened landlines, protected relay nodes, and autonomous systems capable of transmitting release orders even under severe degradation. This emphasis reflected a broader doctrinal judgment that redundancy was valuable only if it remained under national control, and that reliance on allied networks, even if technically robust, introduced political uncertainty incompatible with autonomous deterrence. The evolution of delivery systems during this period further complicated command requirements, as the need to coordinate different platforms with varying readiness states and vulnerability profiles forced refinement of execution procedures to ensure that a single political decision could translate into timely and coherent action without requiring prolonged coordination or external confirmation. French doctrine addressed this by emphasizing simplicity and predefinition, limiting the scope for real-time adjustment in favor of predetermined options that could be executed rapidly once authorization was given, reinforcing the link between decisiveness and credibility. Alliance relations during this period continued to exert pressure on French autonomy, particularly as Western partners sought greater predictability in deterrence posture amid renewed East-West tension. Yet, France consistently resisted calls for integration or shared control, framing its independent command as a stabilizing factor that increased uncertainty for potential adversaries without undermining collective defense. This framing rested on the argument that an autonomous French deterrent complicated adversary planning by introducing an additional decision center whose behavior could not be confidently predicted or constrained by alliance politics, thereby reinforcing overall deterrence even in the absence of formal coordination. Internally, the persistence of autonomy required ongoing cultural reinforcement, as training, doctrine, and institutional identity emphasized national procedures and political primacy over interoperability, ensuring that successive generations of officers and officials internalized the logic of independence rather than treating it as a legacy constraint. Exercises conducted during this period increasingly stressed worst-case scenarios, including leadership isolation, communication loss, and rapid escalation, reinforcing the assumption that deterrence would be tested under conditions of extreme uncertainty rather than orderly crisis management. These exercises highlighted the psychological dimension of command, as the burden of decision-making under isolation and time pressure was treated as an inherent feature of autonomous deterrence rather than a flaw to be mitigated through consultation. Technological change also influenced how France assessed the balance between transparency and opacity, as greater surveillance capability increased the risk that command infrastructure could be targeted, prompting continued emphasis on concealment, mobility, and uncertainty rather than visible hardening alone. This approach reflected a belief that survivability was as much a function of adversary doubt as of physical protection, and that ambiguity regarding the location and status of command authority could enhance deterrence by complicating targeting and planning. By the early 1980s, France's independent nuclear command system had demonstrated resilience not by resisting change, but by absorbing it on national terms, adapting procedures and infrastructure while preserving the core principle that nuclear authority must remain sovereign, centralized, and insulated from external influence. This resilience reinforced the durability of strategic autonomy as a doctrine, showing that independence could be maintained even as the strategic environment evolved and alliance dynamics shifted. The endurance of this system through a period of heightened tension underscored that French nuclear command was not an artifact of post-war insecurity, but a living architecture designed to function under modern conditions, anchored in the belief that sovereignty in the nuclear age required not only possession of weapons, but unquestioned control over their use. As the Cold War entered its final decade, France's command system stood as a distinct model within the Western world, one that rejected shared authority and integrated planning in favor of a deliberately narrow, nationally controlled decision structure, whose credibility rested on its ability to act alone if necessary, reinforcing the idea that strategic autonomy was not merely a policy choice, but a foundational element of state survival in an era defined by existential risk. As the mid-1980s approached, France's independent nuclear command system increasingly reflected a mature acceptance of its own constraints, because decades of planning and rehearsal had clarified that strategic autonomy did not guarantee control over events, only control over decisions. And this distinction shaped how French leaders and planners evaluated the purpose of their deterrent in a rapidly changing international environment. By this stage, French doctrine no longer framed autonomy as a means of matching superpower capability, but as a way of preserving political agency under conditions where larger powers might prioritize their own survival or escalation management over the fate of smaller allies, reinforcing the original judgment that sovereignty in the nuclear age depended on the ability to decide alone rather than on the ability to dominate. This perspective influenced how France assessed arms control initiatives and alliance debates, as French authorities consistently resisted arrangements that implied shared command, automatic restraint, or external verification that could be interpreted as limiting national freedom of action, even while supporting broader stability measures that did not intrude on command authority. Internally, this stance required continuous reinforcement of institutional discipline, because the effectiveness of a centralized command system depended on unquestioned adherence to national procedures across all levels of the strategic forces, and training emphasized obedience to the political decision rather than initiative or adaptation once authorization was given. Communication resilience remained a defining concern, as planners assumed that any nuclear exchange would involve widespread disruption of civilian and military infrastructure, and that command authority might have to function with incomplete information, intermittent connectivity, and severe time pressure, conditions under which simplicity and clarity of procedure were valued above flexibility. This emphasis led to further refinement of fallback arrangements, ensuring that release orders could be transmitted and authenticated, even if primary systems failed, while maintaining strict safeguards against unauthorized use, reflecting the balance between decisiveness and control that lay at the heart of French doctrine. Alliance relations during this period continued to evolve, but France's nuclear posture remained deliberately opaque, as authorities judged that transparency regarding command arrangements would offer little reassurance to allies while potentially reducing deterrence credibility by exposing procedural detail. Instead, France signaled intent through political statements and visible capability, leaving operational command firmly within national discretion. This opacity extended to how France communicated its red lines, as deterrence messaging emphasized the certainty of response rather than the circumstances under which it might be triggered, reinforcing ambiguity as a stabilizing factor. technological change continued to exert pressure on command survivability, as advances in surveillance and precision strike raised questions about the vulnerability of fixed infrastructure, prompting continued investment in mobility, concealment, and redundancy rather than reliance on single hardened sites. French planners recognized that survivability was a dynamic property rather than a static one, dependent on adversary perception as much as on physical protection, and command arrangements were therefore designed to preserve uncertainty about location, timing, and mode of decision-making. This approach reinforced the belief that deterrence credibility rested not on demonstrable control, but on the adversary's inability to be certain that control had been lost. By the mid-1980s, the French nuclear command system had achieved a level of institutional stability in which its core assumptions were rarely questioned, not because they were universally accepted, but because they had become embedded in political culture and constitutional practice, making autonomy a default rather than a debated choice. This embedding insulated the system from short-term political shifts, ensuring continuity of doctrine even as leadership changed, and reinforcing the perception that nuclear command was a matter of state identity rather than partisan policy. The approach also imposed costs, as the narrow decision structure limited opportunities for deliberation and placed extraordinary responsibility on a small number of individuals. Yet these costs were accepted as inherent to the logic of deterrence rather than as design flaws to be corrected. As cold war tensions fluctuated and new uncertainties emerged, France's independent command system continued to function as intended, not by adapting to alliance models or external expectations, but by remaining consistent with its founding principle that ultimate authority over nuclear use must reside unambiguously within the national political leadership. This period thus demonstrated the endurance of strategic autonomy as a governing idea, showing that once embedded in institutions, doctrine, and identity, independent nuclear command could persist even as the international system evolved, reinforcing France's distinct position within the Western strategic landscape, and setting the stage for how it would navigate the final years of the Cold War without surrendering control over its most consequential decision. As the late 1980s approached, France's independent nuclear command system entered a period in which its greatest challenge was no longer construction or consolidation, but credibility under transformation, because the Cold War strategic environment was changing in ways that tested the original assumptions behind autonomy without removing the reasons it had been created in the first place. Arms control agreements, shifting superpower relations, and the gradual erosion of bipolar rigidity altered the context in which deterrence operated. Yet, French planners continued to assume that uncertainty, miscalculation, and asymmetry remained inherent features of international politics, and that reliance on Allied nuclear decision-making would therefore remain incompatible with national survival. Internal assessments during this period emphasized that strategic autonomy was not negated by détente or dialogue, because the core problem autonomy addressed was not hostility but divergence of interest. The possibility that Allied priorities might not align at the decisive moment, particularly if escalation threatened metropolitan territory differently across states. This reasoning reinforced the belief that even in a less confrontational environment, nuclear command authority had to remain strictly national, centralized, and insulated from collective mechanisms that could introduce delay or veto. Technological change continued to shape planning as advances in surveillance, computing, and precision targeting increased the transparency of military infrastructure and raised concerns about the survivability of fixed command nodes, prompting further emphasis on dispersion, mobility, and procedural resilience rather than on static protection alone. French planners treated survivability as a psychological and political condition, as much as a technical one, focusing on preserving adversary uncertainty about the continuity of command rather than on guaranteeing invulnerability, an approach consistent with the broader doctrine that deterrence depended on doubt rather than certainty. Communication systems were continually reviewed and adapted to ensure that presidential authority could be exercised under conditions of severe disruption, and redundancy was maintained not to enable consultation, but to ensure the transmission of a single, unambiguous decision when required. This emphasis reinforced the distinction between autonomy and isolation, as France remained politically engaged with allies while preserving the technical and procedural means to act independently. A balance that required careful management of signaling and reassurance without operational disclosure. Alliance dynamics during this period were characterized by mutual accommodation rather than confrontation, as partners increasingly accepted French independence as a stable feature of Western deterrence rather than an obstacle to cohesion, and French leaders framed their posture as complementary rather than competitive, arguing that an autonomous decision center complicated adversary planning without undermining alliance solidarity. This framing gained traction as the strategic environment became more fluid, reinforcing the idea that diversity of decision-making could enhance stability by preventing over-reliance on a single command authority. Internally, the concentration of nuclear command authority continued to impose heavy responsibility on the presidency, and continuity planning focused on ensuring that succession mechanisms were clear, legitimate, and insulated from ambiguity, because any doubt about who could authorize nuclear use would undermine the credibility of deterrence more quickly than technical failure. Exercises and simulations during this period increasingly explored scenarios involving political shock, rapid escalation, and incomplete information, reinforcing the assumption that nuclear command would be tested under conditions of extreme uncertainty rather than orderly negotiation. These rehearsals reinforced a culture in which decisiveness and clarity of authority were valued over deliberation, reflecting the belief that deterrence failed not because decisions were wrong, but because they were delayed or contested. By the end of the 1980s, France's independent nuclear command system had demonstrated remarkable institutional continuity, surviving technological change, alliance pressure, and shifting strategic narratives without surrendering its core principle of sovereign control. This continuity did not imply rigidity as procedures and infrastructure evolved continuously, but it did reflect a stable hierarchy of values in which autonomy outweighed efficiency, integration, or transparency. As the Cold War approached its conclusion, French planners did not dismantle or dilute the command system they had built, because the end of one geopolitical structure did not eliminate the underlying condition that autonomy was meant to address: the uncertainty of reliance on others for existential decisions. The endurance of this system into the final years of the Cold War thus illustrated that France's nuclear command was not a reaction to a specific adversary, but an institutional answer to a permanent strategic dilemma: how a state preserves political agency when the consequences of dependence are absolute. This realization anchored strategic autonomy not as a temporary deviation from alliance norms, but as a defining feature of French statecraft in the nuclear age, ensuring that control over the most consequential decision a government could make remained unmistakably national, centralized, and beyond external influence, even as the global order itself began to change. In the final assessment of France's independent nuclear command system and its doctrine of strategic autonomy, the Cold War record shows a deliberate and sustained effort to solve a single overriding problem, which was how a medium power could preserve absolute political control over existential decisions in a world dominated by superpower alliances. And the solution France adopted was not technological imitation or alliance integration, but institutional design that embedded sovereignty directly into command authority itself. From its origins in post-war insecurity through its maturation during the Fifth Republic, French nuclear command was constructed on the assumption that deterrence credibility depended less on the size of the arsenal than on the clarity of who decided and under what conditions, and that any diffusion of authority would weaken rather than strengthen national security. This assumption drove a system in which the presidency stood at the center of nuclear decision-making, not as a ceremonial role, but as an operational reality, supported by command structures, communication networks, and execution procedures designed to function under isolation, disruption, and extreme uncertainty. Independence was pursued not as a rejection of alliance cooperation, but as a safeguard against misalignment of interests, reflecting a judgment that even close allies could not be entrusted with decisions involving national destruction, and that the ultimate guarantee of survival lay in retaining the ability to act alone if necessary. The resulting command system accepted high cost, redundancy, and complexity as the price of sovereignty, prioritizing survivability and decisiveness over efficiency and interoperability, and embedding these priorities into political culture, military doctrine, and institutional identity. Over time, strategic autonomy became self-reinforcing, as successive generations of leaders inherited not only the technical apparatus of independent command, but the underlying belief that control over nuclear use was inseparable from the legitimacy of the state itself. The endurance of this system through periods of alliance tension, technological change, and strategic uncertainty demonstrated that autonomy was not a transient policy response, but a stable answer to a permanent dilemma in nuclear politics: the problem of relying on others when the consequences of failure are irreversible. By the end of the Cold War, France's nuclear command system stood as a distinct model within the Western world, neither integrated nor isolated, contributing to deterrence through the certainty of an autonomous decision rather than through shared planning or collective control. Its significance lay not in operational use, which never occurred, but in the way it shaped expectations, signaling that France would neither delegate nor delay the defense of its survival, regardless of alliance context. This posture complicated adversary calculations by introducing an independent decision center whose behavior could not be predicted or constrained by alliance mechanisms, reinforcing deterrence through uncertainty rather than coordination. The French experience thus illustrates that nuclear command is ultimately a political institution as much as a military one, and that strategic autonomy is sustained not by rhetoric or capability alone, but by the deliberate alignment of constitutional authority, command infrastructure, and doctrine around a single principle that the decision to use nuclear weapons must remain unmistakably national. In retrospect, France's independent nuclear command system reveals how a state can preserve agency in a system defined by overwhelming power asymmetry, not by matching that power, but by ensuring that the most consequential decision it could ever face would be made by its own leadership, under its own authority, and according to its own judgment, a lesson that shaped French statecraft throughout the Cold War and continued to define its approach to nuclear deterrence beyond it.